Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Mark. On that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, he took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" The Gospel of the Lord. Please be seated, my friends. I get a little excited when we sing that hymn. It's one of my favorites. Apologize again about the air conditioning. It's a little warm in here. So no one move and think about pina coladas in the beach. Speaking of storms, I'm sure you all have been through a few. Yes. And for some of you, March of 1982 should bring back some memories. Officials determined that the F2 tornado that touched down in the city of Bartlesville that spring evening was the worst in the city's history, with an estimated 30 million in damages to homes and businesses. The hardest hit zones included Frank Phillips and Hensley Boulevards down by Murphy's Steakhouse. God help us if the hot hamburger did not survive. Whew. With wind speeds exceeding 150 miles an hour, Mother Nature met her match in a man named Gus Minch. I hope I'm saying that right. Minch of Minch's grocery store on Highway 123, who spoke in the aftermath of the storm of how his faith was strengthened by axe-wielding National Guardsmen in Jesus. Such storms leave an impression. Why, at my interview, T and I reclined on Catherine Powell's patio up on Circle Mountain. We heard tales of that storm. And I think Steve Van Aken saw the consternation that was growing on our faces, and he did his best to sort of set us at ease. He looked at us and he said, Bartlesville rarely experiences storms of such intensity. Now, if you live in Moore, that's different. We rarely get hit, almost going on 40 years now. But then with a twinkle in his eye and a long pull on his beer, he looked at us and said, "Or you could say that we're due." I confess I don't know much about tornadoes. It seems that most of what I've retained over the years includes scenes from The Wizard of Oz, and that's only when someone talks about twisters. And then again, there is that movie that came out in 1996 with Bill Paxton and Helen Hunt, right? Hollywood and coupe ales are pretty much the extent of my knowledge, which is pitiful when in the wake of real storms, you don't think of Judy Garland or beer. You think of Jesus, and you think about your life. I know I did when Hurricane Sally landed in Pensacola. Teresa and I were out on the porch when we lost power. It was eerie that day because the lights were flickering on and off as the wind picked up throughout the afternoon. And then, in a dead calm, we looked at each other and said, Is this it? And then, almost as if in answer to our unfounded hubris, pop, the power went out, not to be back for a week. We rode out the storm by candlelight, each praying in our own way until something hit our house really, really hard. I got my rain gear on, and Teresa looked at me like I had lost my mind. "What are you doing?" she asked, and I told her I was going out to see what the noise was, and she looked at me, and then she looked out the windows at the trees that were like at a 90-degree angle by this point, and she said, "You sure about that?" And despite my pretty good track record using common sense, I went out into the rain. I know. I found the kids' metal trampoline up against our house, crushed like a beer can. And just as I was turning around, the netting that is used to protect the kids as they're jumping turned into a sail. And that giant metal object came right after me. I don't know what I said in that moment, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't Jesus. The next morning, I awoke to the hum of generators, the smell of pine and bacon, and I realized at that point that the ultimate status symbol in the Panhandle is not a boat or a pool, but a whole house generator. The scene before me was nowhere near the devastation left by Hurricane Michael, however, which tore through the Gulf Coast 2 years before Sally hit us, making landfall on October 11th, 2018. Michael was a Category 4 hurricane with sustained winds of over 160 miles per hour, ultimately inflicting damages of almost $26 billion in its wake. A couple of our friends had taken a church in Panama City, which was just a few miles north of where the eye wall came ashore. And some 2 hours away from them, we held our breath in the days that followed the storm for news of who stayed behind and those who couldn't evacuate. And word finally came by our bishop calling on all churches in the diocese to muster, gathering as much gas and ice and food as we could in hopes of joining the convoy that was heading down south into the heart of the storm zone. We loaded up the backs of trucks. We took mowers off of equipment trailers and packed them. And we packed minivans so tight with supplies that the only thing else that you could fit in there was the driver. Panama City was 2 hours south of us and held no guarantee that when we arrived, we would actually be able to see our friends. But we went anyway. And when I pulled into Panama City that day, the only thing I can compare it with what I saw were the photographs I had surveyed while I was in the Navy that depicted what seaborne ordnance would do to areas if an airstrike was called in. Nothing was left. The town was razed to the ground. A few miles south of Panama City, in a small town called Mexico Beach, one house remained in a little village that had 1,400 residents. And all I could think about was how 1 year after we graduated seminary, that is where Michael and Molly found themselves. It took us 6 hours when we finally reached the town, following a bobcat to get to their door. And Michael is this guy who, when he moves to a new area, checks police response times and ambulance routes and the status of the fire department's equipment. He's prepared in the most precarious of situations, and he has this uncanny ability to hold it together so that others can lose theirs in that moment. He was out in the thicket of downed trees directing traffic, and I thought I was prepared for anything after that 6-hour trek into the wilderness. except for the tightness of his embrace and the story he was about to tell me. Molly and Michael had spent most of their night in the house, and the storm surge made it past the seawall in the wee hours of the morning and entered their home. Pictures of that storm revealed that Michael's cloud cover at that point covered the entire state of Florida. The forgotten coast was forgotten no more. As supplies were being distributed, Michael took me into the nave of the church. Water had pooled in some of the corners and was still there. He told me that there were a few times that night that he didn't think Molly and him were going to make it. I mean, you can literally see the ocean from behind the altar. In surveying the damage, he started pointing to these old live oak trees that were snapped in half and ripped out of the ground. He pointed to all the windows that were down the side of the nave that were all blown out. And no one could miss the remnants of what the sea left in the nave. Conch shells lay where pews were. How devastating it was to walk in that space and to see him look at the space he so loved, seeing it ravaged. And I imagine wonder how they were about to come back. And then he kind of like leveled his gaze at me. He's a big guy. Grabbed my shoulders. And he said, "You know what, Nick? The wind blew all night. The windows blew in, and there was water up to my shins in this place. The next morning when I came in here, he pointed to the sanctuary light. You know what he said? Through all of that, it was still lit." I never really know what to do when the rocks of my life crack. But weep he did. And as I took in that wonderful candlelight, I realized something about the storms of our life. Sometimes miracles happen, and we survive. We survive through grace and through grief. But for the most part, the storms of my life have had me wondering if God was asleep in the boat, or worse, left me to drown. It has often been through the hard, vulnerable, and honest work found in hindsight that I've come to realize, while wishing the sea would calm itself, or screaming into the ferocity of the storm, that there was always a fire burning beside me. And I wish this day that I would have eyes to see its light the next time the waters rise.